Carthage and the Carthaginians are Bosworth Smith. Carthage and the Carthaginians. London, printed by Spottiswoode and Co., New Street Square and Parliament Street. Remains of ancient harbors at Carthage. It's a visual. Carthage and the Carthaginians by R. Bosworth Smith, M.A., Assistant Master in Harrow School, formerly Fellow of Trinity College, Oxford, author of Muhammad and Mohammedanism. London, Longman, Green and Co., 1878. All rights reserved. Okay, this is a Latin quotation. Matri me cujus nomen vive, huic opusculo praetexi deburat, quod materno amore in septem fovebat, marchue peractum amantissimus dedico. Okay, no idea what it means. I should get it translated by. Preface. The pages which follow are an attempt within moderate limits, but from a careful study of all the materials which have come down to us, to give as complete a picture as possible of ancient Carthage and of her two greatest citizens, the only two of whom we have any minute or personal knowledge, Hamilcar Barca and Hannibal. The materials themselves are extremely fragmentary. The medium through which they are presented to us is distorted, and I am only too conscious of my own want of skill in handling them. But whatever the deficiency of the materials and whatever my own shortcomings, I cannot help feeling that I have worked to ill effect if I have failed to awaken in the minds of my readers something of that enthusiasm for the subject and that keen desire to pursue it further, which for some years past has made the labor I have imposed upon myself a labor of love. Whether any such enthusiasm or desire can ever be adequately gratified is a different question, and one which I venture to think does not necessarily affect its intrinsic value. In history, as in other pursuits, more especially perhaps in those branches of history in which the present age has made such rapid advances, the study of long buried seats of empire, of extinct creeds, and of vanished civilizations, the chase is, in a certain sense, worth more than the game and the effort than the result. If by such studies, by the endeavor to picture to ourselves whole races which have long since disappeared, and altars which have long been overturned, the imagination, as we cannot doubt, is awakened and the sympathies enlarged. If we are driven to take a wider and therefore a truer view of the dealings of God with man, to recognize more frankly amidst the endless diversities of the human race its fundamental and substantial unity, to press more closely home to ourselves those questions which are never old and never new, questions always to be asked and never adequately to be answered, of the why and the what, the whence and the whither of a being who has such groveling desires and such noble aspirations, whose capacities are so boundless and whose performances are so sorry, who is so great and yet so little, so evanescent and yet so lasting. We may well rest content if we rise from the attempt with a feeling of stimulus rather than of satiety, of unrest rather than repose. It is possible, indeed, that more extensive excavations on the site of the Birsa and its neighborhood may hereafter prove that the Romans did not complete their work of destruction so thoroughly as they imagined, and that the very rapidity with which they endeavored to carry out old Cato's resolve, destroying everything at Carthage which they could see, was the means of preserving something at least which they did not see. It is possible that the further discovery of Phoenician inscriptions among the numerous islands and coasts over which the influence of that ubiquitous people once extended may increase our knowledge of the Carthaginian language and may give us a longer list of Carthaginian proper names. It is possible that Massils may contain other tablets like that famous one discovered in 1845 when a house was being pulled down. A tablet which actually fixes the tariff of prices to be paid for the victims offered to Baal, and that the recesses of the Lebanon may still conceal another priceless remnant of Phoenician antiquity, antiquity, such as that statue of Baal in a sitting posture, which perished only a few years ago, just before a great Phoenician scholar arrived in the country, and by a cruel fate which is not without precedent in such matters, heard at the same moment of its existence and destruction. If so, we may one day be able to picture to ourselves more vividly that worship of Baal and of Ashtoreth, which is as interesting to the student of biblical as of Carthaginian history. It is possible, once more, that some of the lost books or fragments of the lost books of the Greek and Roman historians who treated of Carthage may yet be discovered and may complete the picture, such as it is, which the Greek colonists in Sicily or the Romans who had tested for themselves the indomitable patience of Hamilcar and had felt the weight of Hannibal's arm were able to form of their redoubtable antagonist. All these things are possible even if they are not very probable. But we cannot venture to hope that any such discoveries, whatever their kind or number, will ever enable us to know Carthage as we know Athens or Rome from its own citizens, or will do more than throw a few scattered lights upon that imperial city which, all but unknown to us during 5 centuries of her growth and her true grandeur, blazes forth into the light of day only in that century which witnessed her heroic struggles and her fall. The historical documents which might have thrown a real light upon Carthage have perished irrevocably. Philinus, the Greek of Agrigentum, who wrote a Carthaginian or quasi Carthaginian account of the First Punic War, we know only from some criticisms of Polybius. Socilus and Silanus, two other Greek historians who, if only they had been worthy of their opportunities, might have given us from their daily personal observation as complete an account of Hannibal's life and conversation as Boswell has given us of Dr. Johnson, have left behind them not a word, and the contents of the native Carthaginian libraries, which the Romans, like rich men who know not what they give, carelessly handed over to the tender mercies of Numidian chieftains, and which Sallust, a century afterwards, must have had in his own hands, have perished by destruction as complete as that which overtook the Alexandrian library itself. We cannot pretend to contemplate the fate of these Carthaginian libraries with the philosophical indifference which it pleased Gibbon to affect with regard to that of Alexandria. For we cannot suppose that the destruction of the Punic literature was in any way a benefit or that its preservation would have been anything but of deep interest and value to posterity. A few words of explanation as to the general treatment of my subject and the comparative prominence which I have allotted to its different parts may, perhaps not unfitly, find a place here. As regards the method of inquiry, I have in all cases gone direct to the fountainhead, reading carefully every passage which has come down to us from the ancients, comparing conflicting statements with each other, and always endeavoring in the first instance to form an independent judgment upon them. On points which seemed in any degree doubtful, I have afterwards consulted the chief modern writers on the subject, such as Gesenius, Heeren, Niebuhr, Arnold, Movers, Kendrick, Lenormand, Mommsen, Bewley, and Ihnay. Where, as is often the case, I am conscious of any distinct debt to these or any other modern writer, I have of course made it matter of special acknowledgement in the notes. But as a general rule, the references I have given are to those to whom I really owe them, to the ancient authorities themselves. I have avoided all prolonged discussion of disputed points, such, for instance, as the route of Hannibal over the Alps, the battlefield of the Trebia, the minutiae of the topography of ancient Carthage, or the exact position of its Spanish namesake. On such subjects, I have endeavored to weigh the arguments on either side and have often, as in the case of the passage of the Alps, waded through what is, in fact, a literature in itself, a very sea of treatises and rejoinders of observations and counter observations, but have been compelled to content myself with giving in a few lines the results themselves rather than the process by which I have arrived at them. The limits of the book may make any other treatment impossible, and indeed, it seems to me that the minute discussion of such points belongs to a continuous history or to a series of monographs rather than to a book which is not intended to be exhaustive and which is addressed as much to the general reader as to the classical scholar. As regards the treatment of particular parts of my subject, in the two opening chapters on Carthage, I have attempted to give a general sketch of the Carthaginian influence and civilization and to bring together into as small a compass as is consistent with any degree of accuracy or completeness all the hints dropped by the writers of antiquity which seem to throw any clear light on the city in the days of its birth, its growth, and its greatest prosperity. In the third chapter, it has been my object to set forth the main differences between Carthage and her great rival and to point out the foundations on which the achievements and greatness of Rome principally rested. It is the more necessary to do this pointedly at the outset because, since Carthage can no longer be heard in her own defense, the historian is bound, throughout his treatment of the Punic Wars, continually to point out those statements which he considers to be colored by the bias or the ignorance, by the fears of the pride of the Roman writers. He is thus driven sometimes to appear as the advocate while he is in fact only acting or wishing to act the part of the judge. That Rome was better fitted for empire than Carthage, and that her victory is, on the whole, with all its drawbacks, the victory of progress and civilization, is a fact to which all history seems to point. But it is nonetheless the duty of the historian to dwell upon these drawbacks and to bring into full relief what little may be said on the other side. The history of the First Punic War I have treated at considerable, perhaps some of my readers may think at disproportionate length. I have more than one reason for doing so. To begin with, the First Punic War seems to me to throw much more light on the energies and character of the Carthaginians as a whole than does the second. The Second Punic War brings Hannibal before us, the first the state which produced him. The First Punic War shows us Carthage as still, in some sense, the mistress of the seas and islands. In the second, she hardly dares to show herself on the waters which were so lately all her own. We have, moreover, throughout the history of the First Punic War, the guidance of Polybius, who had before him, in the preparation of his history, the accounts given by at least two writers who were all but contemporaries or eyewitnesses of the events which they described, one of them, strange to say, not unfavorable to Carthage. Our knowledge, therefore, of the First Punic War is more complete than that of any portion of the second, unless it be that of its first 3 years. Again, most historians seem to have looked upon the First Punic War as a dull and tedious war and have accordingly been content to give it a very cursory notice. Dr. Arnold, for example, who has dedicated a whole volume to the Second Punic War, has given only one chapter to the first. There is no greater mistake, unless indeed it be mine in hazarding an opposite opinion, than to suppose that the first Punic War is dull and tedious. In respect of its battles and its sieges, its surprises and its catastrophes, the Herculean exertions made by both states, and the frightful sacrifices it entailed upon them both, above all, in the consummate genius of one at least of the generals it produced, it seems to me to be one of the most interesting wars in history. If I have failed to make it in some measure interesting to my readers, I repeat that, in my opinion, it is the fault not of the subject but of the writer. Once more, the dazzling genius of Hannibal and the comparative fullness, not necessarily the trustworthiness, of our authorities for his history have hitherto tended to throw into the shade the man who, if he was inferior to Hannibal, was inferior to him alone, the heroic Hamilcar Barca. In point of fullness of treatment, Hamilcar has fared at the hands of our historians, much as has the war in which he bore so large a part. Dr. Arnold, whose noble history was cut short by his untimely death when he had only reached the turning point in the Hannibalian War, the fatal battle of the Metaurus, has given 400 pages to that much of Hannibal's career alone, while he has given barely 20 to Hamilcar. And Dr. Mommsen himself, though he is in no way sparing of his admiration for Hamilcar, has, in point of fullness of treatment, dealt with the father and the son in a manner which, as it seems to me, is hardly less disproportionate to their comparative merits and achievements. It seemed, therefore, desirable to lay rather less stress on what has been done so fully and so exhaustively before, and to give more time and space to what has hitherto perhaps received less generous treatment, and also throws more light on the great city which is my special subject. The chapters relating to Hannibal himself, to the Third Punic War, and to the destruction of Carthage speak for themselves. One more chapter only requires special comment here. In the spring of 1877, after I had finished the first draft of the book and was far advanced in its revision, I was enabled to pay a visit to the site of Carthage and its neighborhood. It was a short visit but was full of deep and varied interest. It was my first sight of an eastern city, and it brought me for the first time into direct personal contact with that vast religious system, which is one of the greatest facts of human history, and which, from causes deep as human nature itself, seems destined, whatever the upshot of the present eastern difficulties, always to maintain its hold on the eastern world. I was able several times to visit the site of the Phoenician city and to study, as far as my limited time would permit me, on the spot those questions of its topography and history, with the general bearings of which I had been so long familiar in books. I walked round the harbors of Carthage, bathed in water which half preserves and half conceals its ruins, explored the Bissa and the cisterns, traced for many miles the course of the aqueduct, crossed the river Bagradas, and examined, among other spots renowned in ancient story, the site of the still more ancient city, the parent city of Utica. In the concluding chapter of this volume, I have endeavored to gather up some of the impressions which I derived from these varied sights and scenes. And I hope I have been able by these means, as well as by various touches which I have inserted subsequently in other portions of the book, to communicate to my readers what I think I gained for myself, a more vivid mental picture of that ancient city whose checkered fortunes I have endeavored to relate. I wish to return my hearty thanks to the Reverend Sir G.W. Cox, barrister, for having carefully revised my book, both in manuscript and in proof, and for having made several valuable suggestions. The Knoll, Harrow, November the 26th, 1877. Okay, we'll skip contents. Go straight to chapter 1. Carthage and the Carthaginians, chapter 1. Carthage. Characteristics of Phoenicians, their defects, size of their territory, their relations to Israelites, early commons in Mediterranean, preeminence of Phoenicians, origin of Carthage, its position and population, its relation to Sicily, our knowledge of Carthage, whence derived, its early history, rapid growth of its empire, its dealings with the native Africans, with the Phoenician cities in Africa, with Tyre, with Sicilian Greeks, constitution of Carthage, the Safavids, the Senate, deterioration of constitution, the 100 judges, close oligarchy, general contentment, social life of Carthaginians, their commercial principles, their agriculture, merits of Mago's work on agriculture, Carthaginian religion, worship of Baal Moloch, of Tanit or Astarte, deeply rooted character of this worship, inferior divinities, worship of Melkarth, Carthaginian literature, the army, the mercenaries and the Numidian cavalry, condition of the masses, colonization, periplus of Hanno, periplus of Himilco, Magos harbor, disaffection of subject races. Was Rome or Carthage best fitted for empire? It was well for the development and civilization of the ancient world that the Hebrew fugitives from Egypt were not able to drive at once from the whole coast of Syria its old inhabitants. For the accursed race of the Canaanites, whom, for their licentious worship and cruel rites, they were bidden to extirpate from Palestine itself, were no other than those enterprising mariners and those dauntless colonists who, sallying from their narrow roadsteads, committed their fragile barks to the meshy of unknown seas, and under their Greek name of Phoenicians, explored island and promontory, creek and bay, from the coast of Malabar even to the lagoons of the Baltic. From Tyre and Sidon issued those busy merchants who carried with their wares to distant shores the rudiments of science and of many practical arts which they had obtained from the far east and which probably they but half understood themselves. It was they who, at a period antecedent to all contemporary historical records, introduced written characters, the foundation of all high intellectual development, into that country which was destined to carry intellectual and artistic culture to the highest point which humanity has yet reached. It was they who learned to steer their ships by the sure help of the polar star, while the Greeks still depended on the Great Bear. It was they who rounded the Cape of Storms and earned the best right to call it the Cape of Good Hope 2000 years before Vasco da Gama. Their ships returned to their native shores, bringing with them sandalwood from Malabar, spices from Arabia, fine linen from Egypt, ostrich plumes from the Sahara. Cyprus gave them its copper, Elba its iron, the coast of the Black Sea its manufactured steel. Silver they brought from Spain, gold from the Niger, tin from the Sicily Isles, and amber from the Baltic. Where they sailed, there they planted factories which opened a caravan trade with the interior of vast continents hitherto regarded as inaccessible, and which became inaccessible for centuries again when the Phoenicians disappeared from history. They were as famous for their artistic skill as for their enterprise and energy. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, the best picture, next after the book of Genesis, of the youth of the world, which has come down to us, the finest embroideries, the most costly robes, The most exquisitely chased wine bowls are of Sidonian workmanship. Indeed, to say in Homeric times that a thing was a work of fine art at all was almost equivalent to saying that it was Phoenician. Did the greatest of the Jewish kings desire to adorn the temple which he had erected to the Most High in the manner least worthy of him? A Phoenician king must supply him with the well hewn cedars of his stately Lebanon, and the cunning hand of a Phoenician artisan must shape the pillars and the lavers, the oxen, and the lions of brass which decorated the shrine. Quote, Thou knowest that there is not amongst us any that hath skill to hew timber like unto the Sidonians. From 1 Kings, verse 5, verse 6. End of quote. Did the king of Persia himself, in the intoxication of his pride, command miracles to be performed, boisterous straits to be bridged, or a peninsula to become an island? It was Phoenician architects who lashed together the boats that were to connect Asia with Europe, and it was Phoenician workmen who knew best how to economize their toil in digging the canal that was to transport the fleet of Xerxes through dry land and save it from the winds and waves of Mount Athos. The merchants of Tyre were, in truth, the princes and her traffickers, the honorable men of the earth. Wherever a ship could penetrate, a factory be planted, a trade developed or created, there we find these ubiquitous, these irrepressible Phoenicians. But the picture is not all bright. The Phoenician civilization, brilliant as it was narrow and self seeking. The spirit of commercial enterprise implies many individual and many social virtues: self reliance and self control, patience and inventiveness, caution and daring, the spirit of discipline and the spirit of progress. But pushed to excess or unaccompanied by more elevated impulses, it involves evils which ensure premature decline. Even in modern times, where development is necessarily more many sided than in the states of antiquity, the exclusively commercial spirit has, after a brief interval, proved to be inconsistent with the highest national virtues. The history of Portuguese and of Spanish, of Venetian and of Dutch commercial enterprise, whether in the Old or New World, affords lamentable proof of this. The impulse of discovery, the thirst for knowledge, the spirit of adventure, which originally accompanied the commercial spirit and lent dignity thereto, are in time swallowed up by it. Wealth is pursued for its own sake only, life is maintained at the cost of the greater part of what makes life worth having, and acts of cruelty and lust, of treachery and ingratitude are perpetrated to gratify the ruling passion. And so, in some measure, was it with the Phoenicians. They were never cowards, but they carried the huckstering spirit into all their dealings. It was easier for them to buy with their gold than to take or preserve with their swords. And as early, even as the time of Ezekiel, we find them, like other commercial nations, hiring mercenaries from Persia and from Ethiopia to fight their battles for them. It was not from high moral motives, for such were almost unknown to the nations of antiquity, at least in their dealings with each other, but from a shrewd and calculating policy that the Phoenicians, alike of the parent country and of the daughter cities, so long forbore to aim at foreign conquest or at territorial aggrandizement. We know well what the tiny territory of Palestine has done for the religion of the world and what the tiny Greece has done for its intellect and its art. But we are apt to forget that what the Phoenicians did for the development and intercommunication of the world was achieved by a state confined within narrower boundaries still. In the days of their greatest prosperity, when their ships were to be found on every known and on many unknown seas, the Phoenicians proper of the Syrian coast remained content with a narrow strip of fertile territory, squeezed in between the mountains and the sea, of the length of some 30 miles and of the average breadth of only a single mile. And if the existence of a few settlements beyond these limits, as for instance Aradus, and Tripolis and Berytus to the north, and Acho and Dora to the south, entitle us to extend the name of Phoenicia to some 120 miles of coast, with a plain behind it, which sometimes broadened out into a sweep of a dozen miles. Was it not sound policy, even in a community so enlarged, to keep for themselves the gold they had so hardly won, rather than lavish it on foreign mercenaries in the hope of extending their sway inland, or in the vain attempt to resist by force of arms the mighty monarchs of Egypt, of Assyria, or of Babylon? Their strength was to sit still, to acknowledge the title or supremacy of anyone who chose to claim it, and then, when the time came, to buy the intruder off. Careless they dwelt, quiet and secure after the manner of the Zidonians, and had no dealings with any man. One branch of business there was, and a lucrative one it must have been, which did tempt the Tyrian merchants occasionally to overstep their natural boundaries even by land. They were slave traders, and they did not disdain on occasion to traffic in the persons of their nearest neighbors and their best friends. Palestine was, throughout the period of the later Old Testament history, the granary of Tyre, supplying it with corn and oil. And mutual convenience seems, in spite of the cruelties of Jezebel and the bloody offerings to Moloch, to have long maintained a friendly feeling between the adjoining peoples. But in the time of the Maccabees, there is evidence to show that Tyrian merchants accompanied the armies of Syria for the purpose of purchasing the Jews who should be taken captive in the war. And when Jerusalem fell before Antiochus Epiphanes, the number of those sold as slaves, doubtless to these same Phoenician slave merchants, equaled that of the slain. To practices such as these, if indeed this may be taken as a sample, which must have been as revolting to the patriotism as their impure worship was to the religious feelings of the Hebrew prophets, are probably due the unsparing and unqualified denunciations of Tyre and Sidon, which we find in Joel and Amos, in Isaiah and in Ezekiel. The religion of the Phoenicians appears to have been originally a rude worship of the powers of nature, but it is certain that their worship of Baal, of Astarte, and of Adonis, as we read of it in the Greek and Roman no less than in the Hebrew classics, involved abominations of which human sacrifice was hardly the worst. The landlocked sea, the eastern extremity of which washes the shores of Phoenicia proper, connecting as it does three continents and abounding in deep gulfs, in fine harbors, and in fertile islands, seems to have been intended by nature for the early development of commerce and colonization. By robbing the ocean of half its mystery and of more than half its terrors, it allured the timid mariner, even as the eagle does its young, from headland on to headland, or from islet to islet, till it became the highway of the nations of the ancient world. And the products of each of the countries whose shores it laves became the common property of all. At a very early period, the Etruscans, for instance, that mysterious people who then occupied with their settlements Campania and Cisalpine Gaul, as well as the extensive region to which they afterwards gave their name, swept all the Italian seas with their galleys, half piratical and half commercial. The Greeks, somewhat later, founded in BC 631 Cyrene, and in BC 560 Barca in Africa, in BC 564 Alalia in Corsica, and in BC 600 Massilia in Gaul, and lined the southern shores of Italy and the western shores of Asia Minor with that fringe of colonies which were so soon to eclipse in prosperity and power their parent cities. Even Egypt, with her immemorial antiquity and her exclusive civilization, deemed to open in BC 550 an emporium at Naucratis for the ships and commerce of the Greeks, creatures of yesterday, as they must have seemed in comparison with her. But in this general race of enterprise and commerce among the nations which bordered on the Mediterranean, it is to the Phoenicians that unquestionably belongs the foremost place. In the dimmest dawn of history, many centuries before the Greeks had set foot in Asia Minor or in Italy, before even they had settled down in secure possession of their own territories, we hear of Phoenician settlements in Asia Minor and in Greece itself, in Africa, in Macedon, and in Spain. There is hardly an island in the Mediterranean which has not preserved some traces of these early visitors. Cyprus, Rhodes, and Crete in the Levant, Malta, Sicily, and the Balearic Isles in the Middle Passage, Sardinia and Corsica in the Tyrrhenian Sea, the Cyclades, as Thucydides tells us, in the mid-Aegean, and even Samothrace and Thasos at its northern extremity, where Herodotus, to use his own forcible expression, himself saw a whole mountain turned upside down by their mining energy. All have either yielded Phoenician coins and inscriptions, have retained Phoenician proper names and legends, or possess mines long perhaps disused, but which were worked as none but Phoenicians ever worked them. But among the Phoenician factories which dotted the whole southern shore of the Mediterranean, from the east end of the greater Syrtis even to the Pillars of Hercules, there was one which, from a concurrence of circumstances, was destined rapidly to outstrip all other others, to make herself their acknowledged head, to become the queen of the Mediterranean, and in some sense of the ocean beyond, and for a space of over 100 years, to maintain a deadly and not an unequal contest with the future mistress of the world. The history of that great drama, its antecedents, and its consequences forms the subject of this volume. The rising African, sorry, the rising African factory was known to its inhabitants by the name of Kirjat Hadeschat or New Town to distinguish it from the much older settlement of Utica, of which it may have been to some extent an offshoot. The Greeks, when they came to know of its existence, called it Carchadon and the Romans Carthago. The date of its foundation is uncertain, but the current tradition refers it to a period about 100 years before the founding of Rome. The fortress that was to protect the young settlement was built upon a peninsula projecting eastwards from the inner corner of what is now called the Gulf of Tunis, the largest and most beautiful roadstead of the North African coast. The topography of Carthage will be described in detail at a later period of this history. At present, it will be sufficient to remark that the city proper, at the time at which it is best known to us, the period of the Punic Wars, consisted of the Birsa or citadel quarter, a Greek word corrupted from the Canaanitish Bosra or Bostra, that is a fort, and of the Kothon or harbor quarter, so important in the history of the final siege. To the north and west of these, and occupying all the vast space between them and the isthmus behind, were the Megara, Hebrew, Magurim, that is, the suburbs and gardens of Carthage, which, with the city proper, covered an area 23 miles in circumference. Its population must have been fully proportionate to its size. Just before the Third Punic War, when its strength had been drained by the two long wars with Rome and by the incessant depredations of that chartered brigand Massinissa, it contained 7 lakh inhabitants. And towards the close of the final siege, the Birsa alone was able to give shelter to a motley multitude of women and children. The river Bagradas or Mejarda, which tells us what was then the most fertile portion of northern Africa, a country smiling with cornfields and gardens, olive plantations and vineyards, forming the home domain of Carthage, entered the Gulf of Tunis on the north side of the city. But the silt which it has brought down, combined with the sand thrown up in that part of the Gulf by wind and tide together, has, in the lapse of ages, altered its course, and its mouth is now to be found not near the site of the daughter, but some miles to the northward, near the parent city of Utica. Facing the Hermaian promontory or Cape Bon, the northeastern horn of the Gulf of Tunis, at a distance of only 90 miles, was the island of Sicily, which, as I glance at the map and as the sunken ridge extending from one to the other still clearly show, must have once actually united Europe to Africa. This fair island it was, which, crowded even in those early days with Phoenician factories, seemed to beckon the chief of Phoenician cities onwards towards an easy and a natural field of foreign conquest. This it was which proved to be the apple of fierce discord for centuries between Carthage and the Greek colonies, which soon disputed its possession with her. This, in an ever checkered warfare, and at the cost of torrents of the blood of her mercenaries and of untold treasures of her citizens, enriched Carthage with the most splendid trophies. Stolen trophies though they were, of Greek art. This finally was the chief battlefield of the contending forces during the whole of the First Punic War. In the beginning, that is, of her fierce struggle for existence with all the power of Rome. Such, very briefly, was the city and such the race whose varied fortunes, so far as our fragmentary materials allow us, we are about to trace. What were the causes of the rapid rise of Carthage? What was the extent of her African and her foreign dominions and the nature of her hold upon them? What were the peculiar excellences and defects of her internal constitution? And what the principles on which she traded and colonized, conquered, and ruled? To these and other questions, some answer must be given as a necessary preliminary to that part of her history which alone we can trace consecutively. Some answer we must give, but how are we to give it? No native poet whose writings have come down to us has sung of the origin of Carthage or of her romantic voyages. No native orator has described in glowing periods which we can still read the splendor of her buildings and the opulence of her merchant princes. No native annalist has preserved the story of her long rivalry with Greeks and Etruscans, and no African philosopher has moralized upon the stability of her institutions or the causes of her fall. All have perished. The text of three treaties with Rome, made in the days of her prosperity, the logbook of an adventurous Carthaginian admiral, dedicated on his return from the Senegal or the Niger as a votive offering in the temple of Baal, some fragments of the practical precepts of a Carthaginian agriculturist, translated by the order of the utilitarian Roman Senate, a speech or two of a vagabond Carthaginian in the penniless of Plautus, which has been grievously mutilated in the process of transcribing it into Roman letters, a few Punic inscriptions buried 20 feet below the surface of the ground, entombed and preserved by successive Roman and Vandal and Arab devastations, and now at length revealed and deciphered by the efforts of French and English archaeologists, the massive substructions of ancient temples, the enormous reservoirs of water, and the majestic procession of stately aqueducts which no barbarism has been able to destroy. These are the only native or semi native sources from which we can draw the outlines of a picture, and we must eke out our narrative arc of Carthage in the days of her prosperity as best we may from a few chapters of reflections by the greatest of the Greek philosophers, from the late Roman annalists who saw everything with Roman eyes, and from a few but precious antiquarian remarks in the narrative of the great Greek historian Polybius, who, with all his love of truth and love of justice, saw Carthage only at the moment of her fall and was the bosom friend of her destroyer. In her origin, at least, Carthage seems to have been, like other Phoenician settlements, a mere commercial factory. Her inhabitants cultivated friendly relations with the natives, looked upon themselves as tenants at will rather than as owners of the soil, and as such cheerfully paid a rent to the African Berbers for the ground covered by their dwellings. It was the instinct of self preservation alone which dictated a change of policy and transformed this peace loving mercantile community into the warlike and conquering state of which the whole of the Western Mediterranean was so soon to feel the power. A people far less keen sighted than the Phoenicians must have discerned that it was their very existence which was at stake. at all events that unless they were willing to be dislodged from Africa and Sicily and Spain, as they had already been dislodged from Italy and Greece and the islands of the Levant by the flood of Hellenic colonization, they must alter their policy. Accordingly, they joined hands in BC 537 with their inveterate enemies, the Etruscans, to prevent a threatened settlement of some exiled Phocaeans on the important island of Corsica. In Africa, they took up arms to make the inhabitants of Cyrene feel that it was towards Egypt or the interior, not towards Carthage, that they must look for an extension of their boundaries. And in Sicily, by withdrawing half voluntarily from the eastern side of the island in which the Greeks had settled, they tightened their grip upon that western portion which, as being nearer to Carthage, was more important to them, and where the original Phoenician settlements of Panormus, Motai, and Solois had been planted. The result of this change of policy was that the western half of the Mediterranean became what at one time the whole of it had bidden fair to be, a Phoenician lake in which no foreign merchantmen dared to show themselves. It was a vast preserve. It was a vast preserve to be caught trespassing, upon which, so Strabo tells us, on the authority of Eratosthenes, ensured the punishment of instant death by drowning. No promontory was so barren, no islet so insignificant as to escape the jealous and ever watchful eye of the Carthaginians. In Corsica, if they could not get any firm or extensive foothold themselves, they at least prevented any other state from doing the like. Into their hands fell, in spite of the ambitious dreams of the Persian kings and the aspirations of patriot Greeks, that greatest of all islands, the island of Sardinia. There's where the Aegacian and the Liparian and the Balearic and the Pitayusian Isles. There's the tiny Elba with its inexhaustible supply of metals. There's too Malta still remained an outpost pushed far into the domain of their advancing enemies, a memorial of what once had been, and perhaps to the sanguine Carthaginian temperament, an earnest of what might be again hereafter. Above all, the Phoenician settlements in Spain at the innermost corner of the Great Preserve, with the adjacent silver mines which gave to these settlements their peculiar value, were now trebly safe from all intruders. Elated, as it would seem, by their naval successes, which were hardly of their own seeking, the Carthaginians thought that they might now at last become the owners of the small strip of African territory which they had hitherto seemed to occupy on sufferance only, and they refused the ground rent which, up till now, they had paid to the adjoining tribes. Step by step, they enlarged their territories at the expense of the natives, till the whole of the rich territory watered by the Bagradas became theirs. The nomadic tribes were beaten back beyond the river Triton into the country named from the roving habits of its inhabitants, Numidia, or into the deserts of Tripoli. The agricultural tribes were forced to pay tribute to the conquerors for the right of cultivating their own soil or to shed their blood on the field of battle in the prosecution of further conquests from the tribes beyond. Nor did the kindred Phoenician settlements in the adjoining parts of Africa escape unscathed. Utica alone, owing probably to her antiquity and to the semi-parental relation in which she stood to Carthage, was allowed to retain her walls and full equality of rights with the rising power. But Hippo Zarytus and Adrumetum, the greater and the lesser Leptis, were compelled to pull down their walls and acknowledge the supremacy of the Carthaginian city. All along the northern coast of Africa, the original Phoenician settlers, and probably to some extent the Carthaginians themselves, had intermarried with the natives. The product of these marriages was that numerous class of Libyan Phoenicians who proved to be so important in the history of Carthaginian colonization and conquest, a class which, equidistant from the Berbers on the one hand and from the Carthaginians proper on the other, and composed of those who were neither wholly citizens nor yet wholly aliens, experienced experienced the lot of most half castes, and were alternately trusted and feared, pampered and oppressed, loved and hated by the ruling state. It would follow from what has been already said of the retreat of the Phoenicians from the eastern Mediterranean and the occupation of this portion of the sea by the Greeks that as Carthage rose, so would Tyre naturally decline. But it was in the days of that decline that Tyre, like other Phoenician cities, gathering fresh strength from her weakness and fresh courage from her despair, displayed those powers of dogged resistance to the inevitable, which would seem to be the peculiar dower of her own and of kindred nations. Three tremendous sieges directed, the one by the greatest of the Assyrian, the second by the greatest of the Babylonian, and the third by the greatest of the Macedonian monarchs, did Tyre undergo even in the days of her decline and fall. And the terrible vengeance of Alexander, when the bitter end had come upon the city which he could break but could not bend, is the best evidence of the more than human endurance which, when they were driven to stand at bay, the inhabitants of the great merchant city could put forth. Tyre herself fell, but the great Tyrian city in the Bay of Tunis still remained. And to Carthage, the few Tyrians, young children or old men who alone escaped, transferred their fortunes and their hopes. In the annals of Phoenician colonization, and it should be remembered, for it sheds a kindly ray of human feeling over a history which, as seen in our imperfect records of it, with what we know as well as what we do not know, is not too human. The closest ties of intimacy were generally maintained between the mother and the daughter cities. There was no mean jealousy, as so often happened among the Greeks, on the part of the mother towards the daughter. There was no precocious self assertion or unseemly arrogance on the part of the rising daughter towards her declining mother. The Persian king might command the services of the Phoenician navy to help him to crush a Greek or an Egyptian rival. But the most ferocious of them all, Cambyses himself, found that he might as well have issued his orders to the winds or the waves as have bidden the Tyrians to take up sacrilegious arms against their Carthaginian children. One enterprise, indeed, the Carthaginians did undertake in obedience to that fiat of the great king, which, to the lasting good of humanity, failed of its object. Xerxes, in BC 480, advancing with his millions of barbarians upon Athens from the east, bade, so it is said, Hamilcar advanced with his 3 lakh mercenaries upon Syracuse from the west. The torch of Greek learning and civilization was to be extinguished at the most opposite ends of the Greek world at one and the same moment. But happily for mankind at large, both attempts were foiled. The efforts of Xerxes ended in the destruction of the Persian fleet at Salamis and the disgraceful flight of the king to Asia. The efforts of Hamilcar ended in his defeat and death at Himera and in the destruction of 150,000 of his army. And by a dramatic propriety which is not common in history, whatever it may be in fiction, this double victory of Greek civilization is said to have taken place in the same year on the very same day. Let us now turn to the political organization of the city which achieved so rapid and marvelous a development and inquire how far it was the effect and how far the cause of her prosperity. The constitution of Carthage was not the work of a single legislator, as that of Sparta is said to have been, nor of a series of legislators like that of Athens. It was rather, like that of England, the growth of circumstances and of centuries. It obtained the praise of Aristotle for its judicious admixture of the monarchical, the oligarchical, and the democratical elements. The oligarchical element, he admits, tended from very early times to a predominance, but that it must have been moderate and beneficial in the use of its power is shown, he remarks, by the fact that its rule was never seriously threatened, either by a despot from above or by the masses from below. It must be remembered, for much of the confusion that exists with regard to the Carthaginian constitution is owing to its being forgotten, that Aristotle's remarks as to the mixed character of the Carthaginian government, however true they may be of the Carthage of the earlier times, are only true in a limited sense of the Carthage we know best, the Carthage of the Punic Wars. The original monarchical constitution, doubtless inherited from Tyre, was represented practically in Aristotle's time and theoretically to the latest period by two supreme magistrates called by the Romans Sophites. Their name is the same as the Hebrew Shophetim, mistranslated in our Bible as judges. The Hamilcars and Hannos of Carthage were, like their prototypes, the Gideons and the Samsons of the book of Judges, not so much the judges as the protectors and the rulers of their respective states. They are compared by Greek writers to the two kings of Sparta and by the Romans to their own consuls. That they were, in the earliest times, appointed for life and not, as is commonly supposed, elected annually is clear from a variety of indications. Unlike the king of the sacrifices at Rome and the king Archon at Athens, they seem, when the kingly office itself was abolished, to have retained those priestly functions which, according to ancient conceptions, were indissolubly united with royalty. Beneath these kings came, in the older constitution, a council called by the Greeks the Gerousia, or Council of Ancients, consisting of 28 members over which the Sophites presided. This council declared war, ordered levies of troops, appointed generals, sent out colonies. If the council and Sophites agreed, the decision was final. If they disagreed, the matter was referred to the people at large. In this and in other ways, each element of the body politic had its share in the administration of the state. But the Carthaginian constitution described and praised by Aristotle is not the same as that of the Punic Wars. In the interval which separates the two epochs, short as it is, a great change which must have been long preparing had been completed. The Sophites had gradually become little more than an honorary magistracy. The Senate over which they presided had allowed the main part of their power to slip out of their hands into those of another body, which, if it seemed to be more liberal in point of numbers and in conformation, was much more exclusive in policy and spirit. The appeal to the people was only now resorted to in times of public excitement, when the rulers, by appearing to share power, tried to lessen envy and allowed the citizens to go through the form of registering what practically they had already decreed. The details of the change are obscure, but there are some points and are sufficient to indicate its general character. The new body consisted of 104 members and was commonly known by the name of the Hundred. Its members were selected indeed from a larger body, who were themselves, in some sense, the choice of the people. But the choice of the people in Carthage fell only on the wealthy. And these, when once they had been so chosen, were responsible to no one for the exercise of their patronage, and filled up the vacancies in the hundred from among themselves, like the members of a close college. The result was an oligarchy like that of Venice, clear sighted and consistent, moderate, nay, often wise in its policy, but narrow in its views, and often suspicious alike of its opponents and its friends. By the old constitution, the Senate had the right to control the magistrates, but this new body of judges controlled the Senate and therefore, in reality, the magistrates also. Nor was it content to control the Senate, it practically superseded it. Its members did not, as a rule, appropriate the offices of state to themselves, but they could summon their holders before them and so draw their teeth. No Shafit, no senator, no general was exempt from their irresponsible despotism. The Shafits presided, the senators deliberated, the generals fought, as it were, with a halter round their necks. The sentences passed by the hundred, if they were often deserved, were often also, like those of the dreaded 10 at Venice, to whom they bore a striking resemblance, arbitrary and cruel. The unsuccessful general, alike whether his ill success was the result of uncontrollable circumstances or of culpable neglect, might be condemned to crucifixion. Indeed, he often wisely anticipated his sentence by committing suicide. Within the ranks of this close oligarchy, first rate ability would seem to have been at a discount. Indeed, the exact equality of all within the privileged ranks is as much a principle of oligarchy as is the equal suppression of all that is outside of it. Language bears testimony to this in the name given alike to the homoioi of Sparta and the peers of England. It was jealousy, for instance, of the superior abilities of the family of Mago and their prolonged preeminence in the Carthaginian state, which had, in the 5th century BC, cemented the alliance between other and less able families of the aristocracy, and so, according to the express testimony of Justin, had first given rise to this very institution of the 100 judges. And it was the same mean jealousy of all that is above itself, which afterwards, in the time of the Punic Wars, united as one man a large part of the ruling oligarchs in the vain effort to control and to thwart and to annoy with 1,000 petty annoyances the one family of consummate ability which Carthage then possessed, that noble minded Barcine gens, that lion's brood who were brought to the front in those troublous times by the sheer force of their genius, and who for 3 generations ruled by the best of all rights, the right divine, that of unswerving devotion to their country, of the ability to rule and the will to use that ability well. But if we assert, as we have implied, that it was the want of power rather than of will on the part of the ruling oligarchy, which ever left to the general in chief that absolute command and that unlimited term of office, which to our minds is essential to the prosecution of a great and distant war, we must take care that we are just. Our ideas of the Carthaginian constitution are derived, such as they are, always from foreign and almost always from unfriendly sources. Moreover, the information given us on such a subject is, all questions of bias or prejudice apart, necessarily even more fragmentary and derived from far more imperfect data than is our knowledge of the material resources or the external relations of Carthage. The student of Carthaginian history stands, therefore, in the position of the judge who, when there is no counsel to be found for the accused, is himself in some measure bound to undertake that office. If the scales of justice are to be held even, he must look upon himself as so far holding a brief for the defense as to be bound to suggest everything that may fairly be urged in suspense of an adverse judgment, and that the judgments of the 100 were not always so arbitrary, and the policy of the aristocracy not always so ungenerous as is often supposed, is clear from 2 indisputable facts. First, that the best and ablest citizens were never backward to place their services in time of war at the disposal of the government. And secondly, that no general of mark, however popular he might be with his soldiers, or however much fortune might have frowned upon his enterprises, ever attempted to use his power for the overthrow of the constitution. Such was not the experience of either Greece or Rome, and we cannot therefore help feeling, in spite of what the Greek and Roman writers say, that there must have been at Carthage a general feeling of satisfaction with the government and an expectation of substantial justice at their hands. If we try, as we cannot help trying, to picture to ourselves the daily life and personal characteristics of the people whose political organization we have just described, and to ask not what the Carthaginians did, for that we know, but what they were, we are confronted by the provoking blank in the national history which has been already noticed. Such few indications as we have are in thorough keeping with the view we have taken of the political exclusiveness of the ruling clique. There were public baths, but since no member of the Senate would bathe where the people bathed, a special class of baths were set apart for their use. There were public messes, as they were called, but these were not, as Aristotle supposed, analogous to the Spartan sycetia, an institution intended to foster manliness and simplicity of life. The black broth of the heroes of Sparta would not have suited the Carthaginian nobles, who, clad in their famous cloth dyed twice over with the purple dye of their African, their Spanish or their Tyrian fisheries, and decorated with the finely cut glass beads, the invention of their Phoenician forefathers, fared sumptuously on their abounding flocks and herds, or on such delicious fruits as those with which Cato moved the astonishment and the envy of the senators of Rome. The Carthaginian sycetia were incentives to luxury, not checks upon it. They were clubs formed originally for social gatherings and afterwards applied to the purposes of political gossip or corruption. Dining tables of the costly citron wood, a single specimen of which Pliny tells us in the time of the Roman Empire cost as much as a broad estate, must have been common amongst those who monopolized the commerce of the countries where alone the citron tree grows. Gold and silver plate cannot have been rare amongst those who controlled the rich mines of Spain, and to whom their ambassadors reported with a touch of scorn upon their return from home that they had been hospitably entertained by senator after senator, but that one service of plate had done duty for all. Objects of fine art, statues and paintings and embroideries, there were in abundance at Carthage, but they were the work of Greek, not of Phoenician artists, and their abundance indicated not so much the genius, critical or creative, of the Carthaginian community as the number of Greek towns, Selinus and Himera, Gela and Agrigentum, sacked in the Sicilian wars. The first commercial state of antiquity, of course, possessed a gold and silver coinage of its own, but of the coins which have come down to us, it is very doubtful whether they belong to the Phoenician city, and it is certain that those which are in any way remarkable for the beauty of their design or execution were struck in Sicilian mints and designed by Greek artists. In the issue, however, of a leather money of a representative value, which would circulate throughout her dependencies, Carthage seems alone of the commercial states of antiquity to have anticipated the convenient invention by modern economists of a paper money. Carthage was, beyond doubt, the richest city of antiquity. Her ships were to be found on all known seas, and there was probably no important product, animal, vegetable, or mineral of the ancient world which did not find its way into her harbors and pass through the hand of her citizens. But her commercial policy was not more far-sighted or more liberal than has been that of other commercial states even till very modern times. Free trade was unknown to her. It would have seemed indeed like a contradiction in terms. If she admitted foreign merchantmen by treaty to her own harbor, she took care by the same document jealously to exclude them from the more important harbors of her dependencies. She allowed her colonies to trade only so far as suited her own immediate interests, and the precautions she took made it impossible for any one of them ever to become a great center of commerce, still less to dream of taking her place. It is remarkable again that while in no city in the ancient world did commerce rank so high, the noblest citizens even of Carthage seem to have left commercial enterprise to those who came next below them in the social scale. They preferred to live on their estates as agriculturists or country gentlemen, and derived their princely revenues from their farms or their mines, which were worked by prodigious gangs of slaves. The cultivation of the soil was probably nowhere in the ancient world carried on with such rich results as in the smiling country which surrounded Carthage. When Agathocles, tyrant of Syracuse, boldly ventured to transfer to Africa the war he was waging with doubtful success in Sicily, he led his army, we are told, through a country crowded with gardens and plantations, everywhere intersected with canals by which they were plentifully watered. Landed estates succeeded to each other in continuous succession, each adorned with splendid mansions which revealed the wealth of the owners. Prolonged peace had stored their abodes with everything which nature or art could supply. The country was filled fertile with every species of fruit tree. Flocks and herds and broodmares abounded in their pastures. Here dwelt the richest of the Carthaginians and vied with each other in pomp and luxury. But the most important factor in the history of a people, especially if it be a Semitic people, is its religion. The religion of the Carthaginians was what their race, their language, and their history would lead us to expect. It was, with slight modifications, the religion of the Canaanites, the religion, that is, which, in spite of the purer monotheism of the Hebrews and the higher teaching of their prophets, so long exercised a fatal fascination over the great bulk of the Hebrew race. The Phoenician religion has been defined to be a deification of the powers of nature, which naturally developed into an adoration of the objects in which those powers seemed most active. Of this adoration, the sun and moon were the primary objects. The sun can either create or destroy, he can give life or take it away. The moon is his consort. She can neither create nor destroy, but she can receive and develop. And as the queen of night, she presides alike over its stillness and its orgies. Each of these ruling deities, Baal Moloch or the sun god, and the horned Astarte or the moon, worshipped at Carthage, it would seem, under the name of Tanith, would thus have an ennobling as well as a degrading, a more cheerful as well as a more gloomy aspect. Unfortunately, it was the gloomy and debasing side of their worship which tended to predominate alike in Phoenicia proper and in the greatest of the Phoenician colonies. Baal Moloch was a malignant deity. He was the fire god, rejoicing in human sacrifices and in parents' tears. His worshippers gashed and mutilated themselves in their religious frenzy. Like Kronos or Saturn, to whom the Greeks and Romans aptly enough compared him, he was the devourer of his own children. In times of unbroken security, the Carthaginians neglected or forgot him. But when they were elated by an unlooked for victory or depressed by a sudden reverse, that fanaticism, which is often dormant but never altogether absent from the Semitic breast, burst forth into a devouring flame which gratified to the full his thirst for human blood. Tanith or Astarte, in the nobler aspects which she sometimes presented as the goddess of wedded love or war, of the chase or of peaceful husbandry, was identified by the Romans, now with Juno, now with Diana, and now again with Ceres. But unfortunately, it was when they identified her with their Venus, Celestis, that they came nearest to the truth. Her worship, like that of the Babylonian Mylitta, required immorality, nay, it consecrated it. The abomination of the Sidonians was also the abomination of the Carthaginians. To one or other of these two deities, almost all the votive tablets disinterred at Carthage, whether they belong to the Phoenician or the Roman city, are dedicated. How deeply the practices that their worship sanctioned must have been rooted in the hearts of the Phoenician people is clear from the fact that long after Carthage and the Carthaginians had been swept away, when a new Roman city had taken its place, subject to Roman laws and administered by Roman magistrates, but peopled in great part by such waifs and strays of the Phoenician population as could be got together from the adjoining districts of Africa, with the rising temples came back also their chartered libertinism and their human sacrifices. A Roman proconsul named Tiberius endeavored to check the practice of human sacrifice by hanging the priests on the trees of their own sacred groves. But this violent attempt to suppress the deep religious instincts of a people who even then called themselves Canaanites was not more successful than had been the peaceful effort made by Darius nearly 5 centuries before Christ. And for several centuries after Christ, we find that Christian bishops such as Cyprian or Christian fathers such as Tertullian and Augustine are loud in their denunciations of the immoralities belonging to a worship which had been so long forbidden and so long retained. Other gods of whom we read, such as Esmun or to whom to whom the temple on the Birsa, the finest in the whole city, was dedicated, were doubtless originally looked upon only as manifestations of the two superior deities, but in time they assumed a separate existence of their own. But there was one of these inferior gods who stood in such a peculiar relation to Carthage, and whose worship seems to have been so much more genial and so much more spiritual than the rest, that we are fain to dwell upon it as a foil to what has preceded. This god was Melkarth, that is, Melech Kirijat, or the king of the city. He is called by the Greeks the Phoenician Hercules, and his name itself has passed, with a slight alteration, into Greek mythology as Melicertes. The city of which he was preeminently the god was Tyre. There he had a magnificent temple which was visited for antiquarian purposes by Herodotus. It contained two splendid pillars, one of pure gold, the other, as Herodotus believed, of emerald, which shone brilliantly at night, but there was no image of the god to be seen. The same was the case in his famous temple at Thasos, and the still more famous one at Gades, which contained an oracle, a hierarchy of priests, and a mysterious spring which rose and fell inversely with the tide, but still no image. At Carthage, Melkarth had not even a temple. The whole city was his temple, and he refused to be localized in any particular part of it. He received, there is reason to believe, no sacrifices of blood, and it was his comparatively pure and spiritual worship which, as we see repeatedly in Carthaginian history, formed a chief link in the chain that bound the parent to the various daughter cities scattered over the coasts and islands of the Mediterranean. The Carthaginian proper names, which have come down to us from one among many proofs of the depth of their religious feelings, for they are all, or nearly all, compounded with the name of one or other of their chief gods. Hamilcar is he whom Melkarth protects. Hasdrubal is he whose help is in Baal. Hannibal, the Haniel of the Bible, is the grace of Baal. And so on with Bomilkar, Himilko, Ethbal, Maharbal, Hadarbal, and Mastanabal. A considerable native literature there must have been at Carthage, for Mago, a Carthaginian Shufit, did not disdain to write a treatise of 28 books upon the agricultural pursuits which formed the mainstay of his order. And when the Roman Senate, in their fatuous disregard for intellect, gave over with careless profusion to their friends, the Berber chiefs, the contents of all the libraries they had found in Carthage, they reserved for this work the especial honor of an authorized translation into Latin and of a formal recommendation of its practical maxims to the thrifty husbandmen of Rome. That many smaller works upon the same subject must have existed at Carthage before a work of such magnitude could have been produced by a man who was an active general as well as an agriculturist is evident enough. That the intrinsic merits of Mago's treatise were not inferior to its bulk is also clear from the influence which the authorized translation at once asserted and long maintained at Rome. What Aristotle was to the medieval philosophers and theologians, that Mago seems to have been in his measure to the Italian agriculturists. Varro, the most learned of the Romans and the author among 489 other publications of the most valuable treatise on ancient agriculture which we possess, quotes Mago as the highest authority on the subject, and other Roman writers have handed down to us with no less respect various maxims on the breeding and management of cattle, the care of poultry and of bees, the planting of forest trees and the treatment of the vine and the olive, the almond and the pomegranate, all drawn from the same fountainhead. Quote, we honor, says Columella, above all other writers, Mago the Carthaginian, the father of husbandry. End of quote. Nor can a work which stood the test of a translation into Greek as well as into Latin have been altogether destitute of literary merit. Be that as it may, what we know of this one specimen of Carthaginian literature does not dispose us to view with more indulgence the criminal carelessness of the Romans. If they destroyed the city and its inhabitants, they might have taken steps to preserve its literature. At all events, they need not have handed it over to its most illiterate and inveterate enemies. But having done a deed of which some of the better spirits, even among themselves, were ashamed, they determined, as it would seem, to leave nothing which could unnecessarily remind them of it. A century later, Sallust saw some of these very Carthaginian books, the property, as he was told, of King Hiempsal. What little of their contents on their subjects he was able to gather from his interpreters, he embodied in his history of the Jugurthine War. But when he reaches the point where he would naturally have launched out on Carthage, it is with a touch of sadness, not unmixed as we would fain hope with shame, that he passes on with the remark, I say nothing about Carthage, for I think it is better to say nothing about her than to say too little. Those members of the Carthaginian aristocracy who did not find a sufficient field for their ability in agriculture or in politics, in literature or in commerce, took refuge in the profession of arms and formed always the chief ornament and often the chief strength of the Punic armies. At one period, at least, of the history of the state, they formed a so-called sacred band consisting of 2,500 citizens who, clad in resplendent armor, fought around the person of their general-in-chief and feasting from dishes of the costliest gold and silver plate, commemorated in their pride the number of their campaigns by the number of the rings on their fingers. It was, however, the one fatal weakness of the Carthaginian state for military purposes that the bulk of their vast armies consisted not of their own citizens, nor even of attached and obedient subjects, but of foreign mercenaries. There were few countries and few tribes in the Western world which were not represented in a Carthaginian army. Money or superior force brought to Carthage samples of every nation which her fleets could reach. Native Libyans and Libby-Phoenicians, Gauls and Spaniards, slingers from the far-famed Balearic Isles, Greeks and Ligurians, Volscians, and Campanians were all to be found within its ranks. But it was the squadrons of light horsemen drawn from all the nomad tribes which lay between the altars of the Phileni on the east and the pillars of Hercules on the west which formed its heart. Mounted on their famous barbs, with a shield of elephant's hide on their arm and a lion's skin thrown over their shoulders, the only raiment they ever wore by day and the only couch they ever cared to sleep on at night, without a saddle and without a bridle, or with the bridle only of twisted reeds which they rarely needed to touch. Equally remarkable for their fearlessness, their agility, and their cunning, equally formidable whether they charged or made believe to fly, they were at once the strength and the weakness, the delight and the despair of the Carthaginian state. Under the mighty military genius of Hannibal, with the ardor which he breathed into the feeblest and the discipline which he enforced on the most undisciplined of his army, they faced without shrinking the terrors of the Alps and the malaria of the marshes, and they proved invincible against all the power of Rome at the Ticinus and the Trebia, at Trasimene and at Cannae. But as more often happened, led by an incompetent general treated by him as not even Napoleon treated his troops, like so many beasts for the slaughter, and sometimes even basely deserted, exposed on a barren rock to perish or betrayed into the enemy's hands, they naturally proved a two-edged weapon piercing the hand that leaned upon it, faithless and revengeful, learning nothing and forgetting nothing, finding once and again in the direst extremity of Carthage their own deadliest opportunity. But if the life of the great capitalists of Carthage was as brilliant as we have described it, how did it fare with the poorest citizens, with those whom we call the masses, till we sometimes forget that they are made up of individual units? If we know little of the rich, how much less do we know of the poor of Carthage and her dependencies? The city population, with the exception, a large exception doubtless, of those engaged in commerce, well contented as it would seem, like the Romans under the empire, if nothing deprived them of their bread and of their amusements, went on eating and marrying and multiplying till their numbers became excessive, and then they were shipped off by the prudence of their rulers to found colonies in other parts of Africa or in Spain. Their natural leaders, or as probably more often happened, the bankrupt members of the aristocracy, would take the command of the colony and obtain free leave in return for their services to enrich themselves by the plunder of the adjoining tribes. To so vast an extent did Carthage carry out the modern principle of relieving herself of a superfluous population and at the same time of extending her empire by colonization that on one occasion the Admiral Hanno, whose periplus still remains, was dispatched with 60 ships of war of 50 oars each, and with a total of not less than 30,000 half-caste immigrants on board for the purpose of founding colonies on the shores of the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules. But the document recording this voyage is of an interest so unique, being the one relic of Carthaginian literature which has come down to us entire, that we must dwell for a moment on its contents. It was posted up by the admiral himself as a thank offering in the temple of Baal on his return from his adventurous voyage, the first attempt and possibly the successful attempt made by the Phoenicians to reach the equator from the northwest of Africa. It is preserved to us in a Greek translation only, the work probably of some inquisitive Greek traveler, some nameless Herodotus who went wandering over the world like his matchless fellow countryman, his notebook always in his hand, and always jotting down everything which was of interest to himself or might be of importance to posterity. Hanno passed, so he himself tells us, the pillars of Hercules and deposited his living freight at various points along the coast of Morocco and the great desert beyond it. At last, he reached an island to which he gave the name of Cerne, and which we may perhaps identify with Arguin, 10 degrees north of the equator, since his crew calculated that it lay as far beyond the pillars of Hercules as the pillars of Hercules themselves were from Carthage. Here he landed the remainder of his Libifinations, and from this point he began his great voyage of discovery. He had already taken interpreters on board, and he now struck out once more towards the south. He passed the mouth of the Senegal River, a river abounding then as now with crocodiles and river horses. Near its banks dwelt a race of savages, no longer the brown men of the Barbary states or of the Sahara, with whom he must have been familiar enough, but the ebony Negroes of the Sudan. They were clothed in skins of wild beasts and spoke a language unintelligible even to the interpreters. They drove us away, says Hanno pathetically, by throwing stones at us. But on went the explorers. They passed forests of odoriferous trees. They saw the natives burning down, as they do at the present day, the withered grass on the hillsides, and they heard by night the sound of pipes and cymbals, drums and confused shouts, the favorite amusements then as ever of the Negro race. On they went till they reached what was very possibly the Cameroons mountain itself, only 5 degrees above the equator. At all events, there is no other volcano on the West African coast, and none therefore answering to the description given by Hanno. The voyagers arrived by night. The country around seemed full of fire, and in the middle of it were flames far higher than the rest, which seemed to touch stars. When day came, they found it was a large mountain, which they well named the Chariot of the Gods. Passing once more onwards still, they reached a gulf called the Southern Horn, which contained an island with a lagoon. It was inhabited by savage people, the greater part of them women, covered with hair. Though we pursued the men, we could not catch any of them. They all fled from us, leaping over the precipices and defending themselves with stones. We caught 3 of the women, but they attacked us with tooth and nail and could not be persuaded to return with us. Accordingly, we killed and freed them and took their skins with us to Carthage. These strange creatures were called by the interpreters gorillas, a name not destined to be heard again till its strange revival 2000 years later, when the mysterious half-human ape of equatorial Africa, then discovered or rediscovered, took its name not unnaturally from its equally mysterious prototype in the Periplus of Hanno. From this point, Hanno's farthest, as it might well be called by subsequent explorers, the admiral returned, for as the record ends with eloquent brevity, here our provisions failed us. Nor was Hanno an exceptional specimen of Carthaginian daring. If only we knew Carthage as we know Athens or Nome, from the Carthaginians themselves we should probably have abundant proof that Hanno was only one example of a numerous class of bold explorers whose services the great colonizing and commercial republic was always able to command. At all events, we hear from Pliny of another expedition which was sent in this same 5th century under the command of another admiral, Himilco, to explore the western coasts of Europe. A fragmentary account of this voyage also has come down to us in the shape of a metrical Latin paraphrase of the document which originally recorded it, and Englishmen and Irishmen at all events will be interested to hear what we are told of its destination. In a 4 months' voyage, keeping to his left the great shoreless ocean on which no ship had ever ventured, where the breeze blows not, but eternal fogs rest upon its lifeless waters, Himilco reached the Estremad's Scilly Isles. Rich are they in metals, tin and lead. Spirited and industrious are the race which inhabit them. Fond too are they of trade, and they traverse the boisterous sea, not on barks of pine or oak, but on coracles made of skins sewn together. At the distance of 2 days' sail from these is the Holy Island, with its abundant emerald pastures inhabited by the Hibernians. Hard by lies also the wide Isle of Albion. One other link connecting indirectly Great Britain with ancient Carthage may perhaps be pointed out here. Most educated people have read Lord Stanhope's Life of Pitt, but too few perhaps know that the title by which he is best known to fame, that of Lord Mahon, he owes to a famous Carthaginian general. The island of Minorca was early colonized by the Phoenicians and afterwards passed into the hands of the Carthaginians. It contains the finest harbor in the Mediterranean. Within it is a large fleet of line of battleships can lie in 7 fathoms of water safe from every wind that blows. This harbor was called Portus Magenis, either after some early Carthaginian explorer of that name or, as seems more probable, after the younger brother of Hannibal himself, who, when he was ejected from Spain by the Romans, passed over to Minorca and spent the winter there. The name has now been softened into Port Mahon. The Spaniards have a saying about it that the ports of the Mediterranean are June, July, August, and Port Mahon. The possession of the harbour made the island of Minorca a bone of contention among all the maritime powers of Europe throughout the last century. In 1708, it was attacked by General Stanhope, who, it is said, by shooting arrows into it, to which were attached papers threatening the garrison with labor in the mines unless they instantly surrendered, induced them to capitulate just before a relieving Spanish force arrived. To commemorate this event, General Stanhope, when he was afterwards raised to the peerage, received as one of his titles the name of the place which he had won. And thus, in the strange vicissitudes of human fortune, an English nobleman bears the name of the brother of Hannibal and also of the reputed founder of the Carthaginian Empire itself. To defray the expenses of this vast system of exploration and colonization, as well as of their enormous armies, the most ruinous tribute was imposed and exacted with unsparing rigor from the subject native states, and no slight one either from the cognate Phoenician cities. The taxes paid by the natives sometimes amounted to a half of their whole produce, and among the Phoenician dependent cities themselves, we know that the lesser leptis alone paid into the Carthaginian treasury the sum of a talent daily. The tribute levied on the conquered Africans was paid in kind, as is the case with the rayas of Turkey to the present day, and its apportionment and collection were doubtless liable to the same abuses and gave rise to the same enormities as those of which Europe has lately heard so much. Hence arose that universal disaffection, or rather that deadly hatred, on the part of her foreign subjects and even of the Phoenician dependencies towards Carthage, on which every invader of Africa could safely count as his surest support. Hence the ease with which Agathocles, with his small army of 15,000 men, could overrun the open country, and the monotonous uniformity with which he entered one after another 200 towns, which Carthaginian jealousy had deprived of their walls, hardly needing to strike a blow. Hence, too, the horrors of the revolt of the outraged Libyan mercenaries, supported as it was by the free will contributions of their golden ornaments by the Libyan women, who hated their oppressors as perhaps women only can, and which is known in history by the name of the war without truce or the inexpiable war. It must, however, be borne in mind that the inherent differences of manners, language, and race between the native of Africa and the Phoenician incomer were so great, the African was so unimpressible, and the Phoenician was so little disposed to understand or to assimilate himself to his surroundings, that even if the Carthaginian government had been conducted with an equity and the taxes levied with a moderation which we know was far from being the case, a gulf profound and impassable must probably have always separated the two peoples. This was the fundamental, the ineradicable weakness of the Carthaginian Empire, and in the long run outbalanced all the advantages obtained for her by her navies, her ports, and her well stocked treasury. by the energies and the valor of her citizens, and by the consummate genius of three at least of her generals. It is this and this alone which in some measure reconciles us to the melancholy, nay, the hateful termination of the struggle on the history of which we are about to enter. Men are we and must grieve when even the name of that which once was great has passed away. But if, under the conditions of ancient society and the savagery of the warfare which it tolerated, there was an unavoidable necessity for either Rome or Carthage to perish utterly, we must admit, in spite of the sympathy which the brilliancy of the Carthaginian civilization, the heroism of Hamilcar and Hannibal, the tragic catastrophe itself called forth, that it was well for the human race that the blow fell on Carthage rather than on Rome. A universal Carthaginian empire could have done for the world, as far as we can see, nothing comparable to that which the Roman Universal Empire did for it. It would not have melted down national antipathies. It would not have given a common literature or language. It would not have prepared the way for higher civilization and an infinitely purer religion. Still less would it have built up that majestic fabric of law which forms the basis of the legislation of all the states of modern Europe and America. Next is chapter 2, Carthage and Sicily. Okay, we will close it here at page 45.